This week on Personally Speaking, our guest is Earl Charles Spencer, who's written a powerful book about child abuse and his own experience in a very private school. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and Charles Spencer joins me now. Charles is the ninth Earl Spencer, the youngest brother of Diana, Princess of Wales, and uncle to Prince William and Prince Harry. Charles was awarded a Master of Arts from Magdalen College, Oxford University. He was a reporter on NBC's Today Show from 1986 until 1995 and has presented for the History Channel. Charles is an author of a number of best-selling historical nonfiction titles and has recently written a book about his experience as a young boy at one of England's most exclusive boarding schools called A Very Private School. In an attempt to come to terms with the trauma and the deep emotional scars inflicted upon him, Charles Spencer reflects upon the misery, the hopelessness, and the abandonment he felt being sent to the all-boys boarding school at the age of 8. Charles is married to Lady Karen Spencer and is the father of 7 children and grandfather of 1. He's here with us today to talk about his life, his family, the values that sustain him. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, Charles Spencer. Charles, let me begin by saying I love the book. I cried at the book, and in some ways I related to the book. The question I wondered about in reading about the brutal experiences, the emotionally traumatic experiences you had, was in this age where I'm very conscious as a pastor of a parish with 3,000 families of the almost helicopter quality of parents where they're right on top of their kids all the time. So anyone reading your book would have to say, well, where are mom and dad when he's going through this? And I know you've addressed this before, but anyone reading it would be in pain for you. Where were mom and dad, particularly when dad had gone through something similar? He would have had an education parallel to your own. Where were they?
I think my parents were typical of people from their social background in thinking that this is what you did with your children, particularly your son, was pack him off to boarding school age 7 or 8. So they were obeying the diktats of their class, you know. So my father was a very loving, gentle, quiet man. My mother had left home, so I think that was part of the problem, the fact that there was divorce in the house. There was no communication between my parents, actually. And equally, there was not really a culture of communication between children and parents from this background. I mean, one of my contemporaries at the school said to me that the strangest thing about being packed off on his first day, aged 8, was finding himself in a car with his father because they'd never had a conversation before. And the father had decided to take him to the school on his first day to warn him that he might be attractive to older boys. And so, you know, very bizarre because that shows the parents knew they were sending their children to a dangerous environment, but they just did it as a sort of a default reaction to the position that they found themselves in socially.
You know, Charles, I'm old enough that my first experience of the boarding school concept in England was watching the 1969 film If, and it was pretty brutal to watch. And I think for a lot of us, we thought, well, that's the movies. But actually, you're telling us it was, in fact, what happened. Now, you mentioned the divorce, and I wanted to ask you about that. Mom leaving with another man, moving to Australia. How have you processed that? It's certainly not unique in that many people do split up, and very often one parent becomes dominant, the other is missing. In terms of like the forgiveness aspect of life, how did you handle someone who should have been there for you, namely mom, being so far away?
Well, as a child, after she left, I adored her. I
Mm.
mean, I didn't see as much of her as I wanted to. And I think in a way that made me love her more. And it wasn't until I hit adulthood that I looked at that in any depth. And I think actually it was me having children of my own made me quite angry towards her. I didn't specify it because I'm English and we don't talk about things.
Right.
But I then actually, after she died, very soon after she died, and it wasn't connected to that fact, I went to a retreat, really, for intensive therapy about childhood. And the best thing about that, it's an American thing called the Hoffman process. And there's quite a few branches around your country. But one of the best things about that was letting go of blame of parents. It doesn't do any good. And it's about, I don't know if it's a Christian thing or a common sense thing, to be honest, Monsignor, but they obviously had things they had to deal with in their own childhoods. And I don't believe many parents choose to parent badly.
Right.
I'm a parent who, I've got 7 kids, and I'm sure each of them could have a very long list of things I've got wrong, but
Right.
I haven't tried to get them wrong.
Yeah. I noticed in the book too, a very private school is the name of the book. Charles Spencer, the author, is our guest. I noticed that, I guess nominally, all these schools would call themselves at least culturally Christian. I mention that because mandated chapel, mandated services, that kind of thing. But if you remember, Charles, from that time, on the one hand, you're being brutalized and sexually abused in the school. On the other hand, we are promoting this image of a loving, merciful God. Uh, how in the world did you bring those two realities together, if at all?
Mm. Well, I think one of the problems with the school I was at was that the headmaster presented himself to the world as a deeply Christian man. And at that time, England now is perhaps less Christian than it was, but back then that went a very long way. And I think, particularly for parents of the backgrounds I've mentioned, they were very comforted by this man presenting as that. And in fact, he would lead our prayers in the evenings. And he even on Wednesdays, we had the service of Compline. But the point is that for me, that level of Christianity, it was a daily occurrence. There were services every day in the school and services every week in the church. It was just part of our day, and
Mhm.
prayers by our bedside at night before we got into bed. So it was a part of the routine rather than a spiritual necessity or want.
Charles Spencer talks eloquently in this powerful book that I hope our listeners and viewers will pick up about two kinds of brutality. One brutality is from the headmaster, and the other is a woman who sexually exploits him. I was wondering if was part of your background in terms of being Christian, the importance of forgiveness, and has it been possible for you to find your way to forgive those two people who did pretty awful things?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know. So I people have said, why don't I prosecute or hand over this woman who molested me when I was 11 to the authorities? Well, I did. I wrote to the authorities about 15 years ago and said, look, if anyone else comes forward with accusations of sexual depravity from this school, I will back them up because I knew other boys had suffered it too. I know 3 or 4 others. And nobody has, but I've seen the devastation in their lives, actually. I mean, really, really very obvious things. And at the same time with the headmaster, he's dead now. I, 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 I was quite frightened of him, you know. He left, he was a terrifying figure in the school,
Sure.
incredibly powerful. In fact, I lean on a quote at the beginning of one of my chapters, which Winston Churchill said, no prime minister has ever had so much power as a private school
Right.
headmaster. And it's true, especially I call the book a very private school because this headmaster, on purpose, I believe, closed down the outside world. So the parents weren't allowed ever to drop by. They might have seen something very unsavory going on at the school. I found him too chilling. And to be brutally honest, I've no wish to see the woman who sexually
Right.
abused me when I was a child ever again.
Yeah.
It was a very strange moment. I added it to the book, but when I'd finished the body of the book, I sent it to Simon and Schuster, and at that point, I thought I've got to do something else. I've had 4.5 years of very testing time writing such a gruesome book, and I thought, I live in a lovely historic house here. I thought I'll go and do something different. I went up into the top floor of the house here, to help the curator move some books from a shelf. And I reached up to get one, a tiny book at the top, and it was my planner from 1976, a little
Oh,
schoolboy's planner. And when I opened it, I was so shocked to find her, the woman who had abused me, her handwriting in the flyleaf of it. And she had written she wrote me, the word M-E, and then her postal address, her mailing address, and then her phone number. And I rocked back on my feet because me, obviously, she didn't want to put her name there. She knew she was doing wrong. Me, as in, if I ever read that, would know who it was. And then also, this was my extrapolation, but I felt she was saying that I was still hers, you're mine. And it really did rock me. So I would be very happy if the rest of my life I never had anything to do with her. If the authorities chose to prosecute her, of course, I would stand witness.
even so many years after her passing, when I mentioned that you were going to be a guest on our program, of course, everyone remembers your brilliant defense of Princess Diana. But I found myself wondering about the life you led, especially in light of the book. Who in your life, Charles, have been you were a defender for her, but who was your defender?
Well, it was me. If you, I don't want to sound in any way proud because it's not that. But if you are chucked into a cauldron like a boarding school by yourself, you look after yourself. I actually had the UK book launch last night in London, and it was wonderful to invite 20 or so guys who had helped me write the book by giving me their absolutely appalling recollections of the place. And I think also we were like brothers to each other. There were really dangerously bad boys there too, serious bullies, very, very chilling. But the most of us were just sort of, I hope, nice enough guys who just wanted to get through it. And so there was that. There was a sort of quiet resistance by the less unpleasant boys against what was going on at the school.
Earl Spencer's our guest. You said at one point in the book that for a lot of parents, they would defend the corporal punishment that took place because, well, after all, the discipline didn't seem to hurt you. You grew up, you turned out to be a productive member of society. I think they're wrong. But having said that, I wonder, as a parent of 7 children, how does one discipline? As a celibate priest, I'm asking you, how does one discipline 7 children?
Well, I don't believe in physical pain. I have once struck the buttocks of one of my children when they pushed their brother. One of my daughters pushed their young brother absent-mindedly, I hope, in front of a passing car. And in the
Oh, God.
shock of
Oh,
that moment, I did.
yeah.
But I don't believe in corporal punishment. I think it's bullying and not at all fair. When I was packed off to the school, no one had warned me that that was part of the deal. But for the headmaster, that was the center of his day. I believe he was a sadist, and the school
Mhm.
was really based around the necessity for him to have 6 or 7 boys to beat, and he was clearly aroused by that. We could see that, and he ritualized it in a very horrible way, and would call his favorite boys down in the middle of the night and make them strip, pretending he was a good Christian. He told one of my friends. I only found this out when I was writing this book, but he told one of my friends. He said, you must be so disappointed in your parents because they're getting divorced. Well, he was 11. He hadn't really processed it. And he went, oh, yes, sir. And then the headmaster said, and so now I'm your father. And the basic relationship between a father and a son is one of honesty. So my friend was called down late on Sunday nights for what were called his Sunday night confessions by the headmaster. And the headmaster would strip him and tell him to share what he had done wrong that week, schoolboy misdemeanors. And then he would say in a deep voice, "You've very much disappointed me," and then would beat him and fondle him. So it was very ritualized, very thought out, I imagine.
Charles, do you have a way of communicating with those 7 children of yours? You talk in the book about not coming forward to your parents and telling them a whole lot for many reasons that are in the book. But do you think right now that the children you've been blessed to have would come to you or to their moms with whatever's bothering, whatever's troubling them? I say very often in church that I think most of us have a dark corner of the soul where in that locked closet we have embarrassing sins that we don't mention. because we think they're too awkward. Would your kids feel that there's nothing I can't tell my dad that is going to in any way change the way in which he loves me?
I really hope so. I mean, for me, that would be the hallmark of a healthy, successful relationship on both sides, father and children. I have to say, I was probably very boring for my kids because of what happened to me. I would cross question them about every member of staff and how they were with them. And I would slide it in the car on the way to school and just say, is there anyone who makes you feel awkward? So I was hyper vigilant. Now, of course, that doesn't mean I protected them entirely at all, but I was very aware of that. One of the reactions I had to my childhood was with my first four children. I moved to South Africa with them. I had worked actually down there and I really liked it. And I wanted to give them a slice of something different in their lives. And I was so happy when they came back from their first day at school in Cape Town, South Africa, with little pieces of paper on which they had been asked to draw themselves. And the teacher had said, now that is you, and that is sacred, and no one must ever touch you, ever, without your permission. And that was so directly contrary to what I had grown up with. And I just, it almost made me cry because it was so perfect.
Earl Spencer's our guest. A very private school is the name of the book. You're so honest, painfully honest, as you know in the book, and you also have talked so openly about the three marriages that you've entered into. There are some people who would wonder when a marriage goes south and a second marriage goes south, why even try marriage again? What motivated you to say, I'm not giving up on this institution of marriage. I'm willing to love again and to commit again when I've been through some pretty painful times.
I do believe in marriage. I
Mm,
do believe in it, not so much as a religious sacrament, to be honest, but as a foundation of security,
okay.
and particularly for children. It's marriage is obviously difficult, and I mean, there's a lot of places in Europe where it's probably under 50% of couples actually live in a marriage now, especially in Scandinavia or whatever.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. It's a very good question. I think I've ended up in relationships where I wanted to have a child with that woman. And I thought the stability of marriage would be good for the child and for the family. So I think it's very simple. And I do, nobody enters, well, I don't think many people enter a marriage thinking it's going to fail, but
Right, right.
that has sadly been the case with me twice.
The experience in this book that is striking to me is the quietness with which you carried your abuse, and I mention that because, as you well know, probably not just in the Catholic Church, but in so many churches, institutions, while 4% of Catholic priests have abused children, 96% of us suffer the tarring of being related to them, and for many children who come forward now as adults, the mystery is why not talk about it early, why not bring it to the fore? As a person who's been through sexual abuse, is there a proper way for churches or any institution, the Boy Scouts, anyone to be handling this? And what would you say to the person who even now feels they are subject to abuse and decides to bury it deep and doesn't want to look at it and worries about the
Mm.
ramifications of going public? You've been there. What would you say, Charles?
Well, I do think with the victims of abuse, I would urge them to speak out.
Mm,
Not that they don't have to go public, but to tell their spouse or their partner or somebody close to them, a sibling, and or a parent if they're still young. The thing is, there is a shame attached to it. I didn't really recognize that I was ashamed, but I didn't tell anyone. My sister, I have two sisters, surviving sisters, and they were so appalled when I finally told them this, what, 2 years ago, when I was 57 and they're in their 60s. But they are mortified that I didn't tell them, but it just never crossed my mind. But I think if people can talk about it, it does help them. It does help others. I've been amazed. I went to a restaurant 2 nights ago in London, and the maitre d' comes to me because I arrived early, and he just said, "Thank you for writing your book. I've never talked about it, but it happened to me too." And I said, "Well, you've talked about it to me now, and maybe there's someone else you can talk to, because a whisper to me in a quiet moment is lovely, but hopefully it'll lead to more. Not this word closure. I haven't got closure. I've recognized that there is a part of me that died in the sexual abuse, and I really am not somebody who gives up very easily, but that is the case. But I can live the rest of my life in a healthy and fulfilled way, and it means that that little dead bit doesn't sort of spread.
I've often wondered, and I suppose someplace along this journey you have too. Um, while what that woman did was monstrous, I often try to get into the head of the person who does the abusing. Do you have any insight at all into why a person would take advantage of a young child? It's not even sexual. It's got to be
No.
about power, or what's the reason? Have you spent time thinking about why this man would delight the schoolmaster in wounding young men, or why this woman, an adult, would find any pleasure in abusing sexually a child? What kind of mind is that?
You know, it's so extraordinary. I used to look at newspaper reports, and when you see young man raping a very old woman, you're right. You're not dealing with a sexual matter here. You're dealing with aggression or control, something like that. And I just think, with particularly actually with the woman who sexually abused me when I was very young, I tried very, very hard to think what it was, and I came up with all sorts of scenarios. Was it that she had been molested in her own time? What there must have been a reason. I'm with you. It can't just come out of nowhere, I don't think. So I'm not. And then I thought, am I trying to, you know, make excuses for them? And because I don't want to do that either. And do you know what I did, Monsignor? I basically said to myself, they did it for their reasons. I don't know what their reasons are, and I don't actually have to. I feel sorry for them on some level because I can't imagine anyone in a healthy place would do that. But at the end of the day, I can't excuse them because I don't understand it.
Earl Spencer's our guest. The Very Private School is the book we're talking about. I had the privilege years ago of being a close friend of Cardinal Basil Hume of Westminster. And when we talk about faith in England, he'd say, well, it's culturally there, it's historically there, but whether or not it's a lived experience of heart and soul and mind, he said, I'm not sure we're not going through a religious period in England. I mention that because I'm fascinated by belief or the lack of belief. I've had on this program people who call themselves atheists, agnostic, believers of all sorts. When you've gone through something like you have, and again, I go back to that question of very often when I do a funeral, let's say I have a 2-year-old who dies of cancer, and people feel like at one level they have to be loving God, but on the other hand, there's probably a part of them wants to shake their fist in God's face and say, how could a good God allow this to happen? Now, as a person who's been through what you've been through, Charles, where is God in your life?
Well, I have to say, my past experiences have not affected my relationship with God.
Okay,
So I am Church of England, which would be Episcopalian over with you probably.
right, right.
And so I don't know what Episcopalian is like, so I have to step back. But Church of England over here is a sort of code for I believe in God, but I just go to church at Christmas, Easter, weddings, and funerals. And I try and think in a kind of Christian way because that's the way I've been brought up. But I'm not studying biblical texts. And so I have a I would say a semi-lapsed Christianity. But if I was on my deathbed, I am a Christian, yes.
Yeah.
And actually, I have this rather bizarre thing. When Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome, he basically brought in a hugely secular element to the church in England. And very extraordinarily, for a man, I've just admitted where I am, I get to appoint or help appoint 15 priests around England in certain parishes because of historic rights by my family. Now, I acknowledge where I come from on this. So what I try and do is represent the lay community and
Okay.
talk to the bishop. So the bishop will say, hey, I really like this person because of their theology or whatever. And I'll talk to the community and they say, yeah, he or she is nice, but we're looking for someone more like this. So I see myself as a a broker on behalf of the community rather than I'm not going to ask them to say what the catechisms are.
This is a left field question, but you touch on it so powerfully in your book. The amount of homosexual activity that will take place during the school years, and then people leave school and they end up marrying and having children and going on with a heterosexual life. But it's just intriguing to me that everything I've read about it says that England had, until I think the 1960s or 70s, incredibly strict intolerance legally for the homosexual person. So I'm wondering, how is it possible that people could have had these experiences in private schools, in boarding schools like the one you went to, and still be in the public square so intolerant of those who are gay?
Well, it's a big fat case of hypocrisy, Monsignor.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, people were being sent to prison
Yes.
by judges who had been indulging themselves. So, I'm afraid human nature, as you would know better than me, is constantly baffling and quite often disappointing.
Earl Spencer has been our guest. His book is a very private school. I want to recommend people get it and read it. It's painful to read because he and others suffered for a long time without protection and without defense. But it's a necessary book in that happily, the same boy who suffers in this book becomes the individual we've been listening to on this program who Charles, no blowing smoke up your dress, but you come across as a wonderfully good man who admits, I don't have it all together. I probably never will. But you move forward with your life. You haven't allowed the problems that you outline in this book to paralyze you, and you never give up. You're amazing, and a source of real encouragement to all the rest of us. Thank you so much for being on Personally Speaking.
Well, I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been. It really has been. Thank you for a very, very entertaining and interesting and stimulating time.
As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us. If you need to reach me, you can do that at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. We're also, you're probably listening to this on Sirius XM, the Catholic channel, but if you want to watch the program, we're on YouTube. You can search under Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. We're also on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante and on Instagram at Personally Speaking Podcast. Please share and tell your friends and family about our program. I've been privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.